All right, folks, what better day than for our next session of reading the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy article on pacifism than today, the second anniversary of October 2nd, October 7th, on which there are reportedly peace talks ongoing right now in Egypt between, Israel and, I suppose, Hamas, Palestinian civilians, since they're saying Hamas will not be in control of the second state, basically, in this. Someone correct me on the details of this proposal. I'm learning in real time with the rest of you, of course. What I can bring to the table that I've already learned is how to read the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy on pacifism. So I'll stick to my own expertise, I suppose, although you can read the blog article I just put out called My Mom Taught Me Not to Sing Have a Nagila So Much, if you want a more topical take. But I'm going to take us right back to the theory. So let's share my screen. Deontological pacifism, section 4. Section 4, and let's remember the table of contents, folks. How many sections are there? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. So we'll probably see 5 and 6 in future episodes. Maybe we'll do 4 and 5. See how many sections I get through today. I am going to go out, I think, in observance of October 7th, but let's see here. I have about 2 hours of Sam Harris to listen to. Not that I agree with his take on free will, but he's at least worth listening to, despite his mistakes. Okay, so we'll talk about free will some other time, I guess, unless it comes up here. 4. Deontological pacifism. Deontological pacifism is closely related to absolute pacifism, right? But you don't have to be an absolutist to be a deontologist, right? People conflate them. Mostly because people are absolutist about everything, because it's kind of entry level to thinking is to just start with, well, let's say there's, like, when there's only one option, you're not thinking. When there's 2 options, you're barely thinking, and that's absolutism. And when there's 3 options, that's ternary logic, as I was just addressing in Ben Burgess's new Substack article that he called, quote-unquote, my preferred solution to the liar paradox. Look that up, because I provide a better solution that is goes beyond ternary and this sort of thing. And okay, so you don't need to be an absolutist. Just remember that, if you remember anything at all in philosophy, that you have to compare things to calibrate semantics. Absolutism is a bit of a euphemism. When we say coherently that we're free speech absolutists, it just means sort of free speech number 1 right now. It's to be tested by future conflicts between virtues, between goods. And that's how a polytheist would think of it. Okay, so deontological pacifism is closely related to absolute pacifism. Deontological approaches to morality focus on duty and right. Yes? So, I hope that's zoomed in enough. One typical idea for deontological pacifism is that there is a basic law or principle that prohibits killing, such as, quote-unquote, thou shalt not kill. Of course, I really want to say thou shalt, because my first book of that nature was King James Version. The most famous theory of deontological ethics is Kant's. Yes, I got King James before Kant. Kant's categorical imperative is formulated as follows, quote, act according to that maxim by which you can at the same time will that it should become a universal law, unquote. This is also known as, well, what if everybody acted that way? Not just, well, if all your friends jumped off a cliff, would you go jump off a cliff? But what if everyone jumped off a cliff? Do you really support that as a blueprint for life? A default, it certainly can't be a default rule. So there's a sense in which when you violate this Kantian maxim, you're somehow letting yourself get away with an exception. Now, whether that's a transgression or a nuance, I think that devil is in those details. It is difficult to supply content to this imperative. It's not that hard. Thus, it is not clear. I think we just did it. Thus, it is not clear that the Kantian imperative can be used to rule out war. Oh, okay. Indeed, Kant is a defender of a version of the just war theory, in part because he believes that states have a duty to defend their citizens. Right? Analogously, if you're, let's say, we live in an era before advanced weaponry, so that men are physically stronger, and someone breaks into your house, you have a duty to defend your wife or your wives, etc., your children. Although Kant is not himself a pacifist, one might be able to ground pacifism in Kant's alternative version of the moral law, quote, act so that you treat humanity, whether in your own person or in that of another, always as an end, as never as a means only, unquote. And I'm sure a lot of you learned this as sort of lesson 1 about Kantian ethics in undergrad. And that's what it means. No one wants to feel like a tool, is the colloquial bro-sphere version of that, right? When someone's like, man, she's treating me like a tool, what he's really saying is that she's violating the Kantian maxim, just quoted. Some pacifists use the second formulation of the categorical imperative to support their position by claiming that war treats persons as means and does not respect them as ends in themselves. That's really depends what the war is being fought over, because the war could be fought over this very principle, right? If it's a religious war over a moral value, I mean, that's obviously frequently used as an excuse for just Malthusian territorialism. But one version of this idea has been defended by Soren Reeder, who argues, there's some nominative determinism for you, by the way, he became a real reader, who argues that the basic presumption of the moral status of persons leads to pacifism. I agree with that, just not necessarily absolute pacifism, which they're sort of saying here. Although Reeder argues that one can arrive at this perspective from both a consequentialist approach and a Kantian one, she relies on the basic intuition that respect for persons as ends in themselves requires us not to kill them. Yeah, they have a hard time pursuing their ends when they're killed, unless, of course, they're have a whole plan to be martyred or something. It is possible to use this deontological principle to support a maximal extension of pacifism, such that the prohibition against killing might be extended to include a prohibition against killing non-human persons. This interpretation would obviously require a further analysis of the notion of personhood. Is your dog a person? Well, hopefully your dog's cool enough that he's a person, you know. I think some dogs get there. Another version of deontological pacifism has been defended by Robert Holmes, who claims that morality, properly speaking, focuses on individuals, while war focuses on defending collectives, which are not the proper focal point of morality. I mean, here, he must be using the word morality to mean peacetime civilian morality, which... my grandfather was a civil servant in the military. He knew a bit about the difference between the conversation at home and the conversation at work in terms of morality, I'm sure, although he couldn't tell us about that. It's nevertheless a very common response to pacifists that, well, it's easy for you to be an absolute pacifist as you're a civilian during peacetime without conscription. But that peace comes from somewhere is the usual rejoinder. And, with the accusation that we're doing that job for you, you damn draft dodger. Up in Canada, I'm in Canada, for anyone listening abroad. There's a lot of dirty draft dodgers up here, but there's no shortage of people, which means there's a ready target for anyone who wants to shit on the draft dodgers. Because there's got to be some, walk into a room, you'll find one maybe descended from a draft dodger, or they were just fleeing the slave trade and not wanting to be part of it either. In addition to killing human persons, war violates the moral status of persons when, for example, soldiers are viewed as interchangeable cogs in the war machine. Right, so this is a certain way of viewing soldiers as an ends, not as a means, not an ends. You might think an anarchist militia wouldn't operate very well because every soldier could have their own opinion. I think it really depends on how you blend those systems. You could have a military with much more democracy, just as you could have a corporation with much more democracy. It's called a cooperative. You can elect a manager rather than, being ruled over by a manager. You can have elections every year for the manager or for, the generals. Elect generals, imagine that, if the troops elected the generals. One might then criticize the apparent quote-unquote herd mentality of militarism as Albert Einstein did when he called the militaristic patriotism of the masses a sort of quote-unquote loathsome nonsense. So I suspect he'd agree that it'd be preferable to have a military that runs like a cooperative with worker council meetings every week. Obviously, on the battlefield, you don't always have time for a meeting, which is why you do things like electing a manager or electing a general. Or electing a president. We already have this idea in the actual government itself. So if we can elect the person who controls the military, why can't we elect people at higher levels of the military? You might say, well, the general public doesn't know who's a good general. Yeah, but the troops do. The idea of conscription seems to run counter to the idea of respect for persons. Once again, depends what the war is being fought for. If they're fighting the war to establish respect for, let's say, the Jewish persons holocausted by Hitler, it doesn't seem to run counter to that idea at all, does it? If the alternative is a loss of respect for persons, you can see we're in the deontological section here. Anyway, I'm not an absolutist. I can still be a deontologist. And pacifists may argue that it is somehow disrespectful to require soldiers to conform to military virtues such as obedience to authority. Just picture that scene in Hair where the guy jumps on the table at the military dinner or whatever. The movie Hair. By the way, just stop this video and go and watch the movie Hair if you want to learn about pacifism. Like, don't listen to me. First, go watch the movie Hair. Don't listen to me. Politics is downstream from culture, and so is philosophy. Like, language is downstream from music. Like, listen to the music first. The pacifist music of the late 60s. Or, like in the blog article today, I wrote about freedom anthems like Hava Nagila and Amazing Grace that are paired side by side in the Royal Conservative Music's history textbook. Arguments against militarism along these lines were made famous by Thoreau, who claimed that in military service, quote, the mass of men serve the state thus, not as men mainly, but as machines, with their bodies, unquote. The more important critique of the way that war betrays human dignity can be found in the pacifist critique of the killing that happens in war. Pacifists might claim that war is a violation of human rights. Once again, a war might be fought to uphold human rights, but more concretely, the pacifists may claim that all human beings have a right to life, and that killing in war violates this right. I mean, as by default, yes, and that's the way to be deontological without it being absolute, is something like default logic. You don't have to get as crazy as conditional probability if you need non-monotonicity, but default logic will do it for you more simply to be able to say, yeah, by default, that's immoral. And there are exceptions, and they prove the rule is in they test the rule. That's what the original etymology of that is, by the way. It used to drive me crazy as a petulant teenager, like, what do you mean exception proves the rule? It means the exception tests the rule. Just like in test-driven development in software, you have test cases to test the rules, the code. So we have moral code, and then we have real life that tests the moral code. Anyway. This idea has been rejected by Anscombe, Narveson, and others who argue that the idea of human dignity or human rights can necessitate the use of violence in the defense of these rights. Okay, Anscombe. This sort of objection holds that it is both inconsistent and immoral for pacifists to reject the use of violence in defense of human rights. As David Lubin puts this, quote, such rights are worth fighting for. They are worth fighting for not only by those to whom they are denied, but, if we take seriously the obligation which is indicated when we speak of human rights, by the rest of us as well, unquote. One of the ways that pacifists can reply to this objection is to emphasize the difference between personal nonviolence and war. Pacifists may, a person can wage war. Pacifists may accept that personal self-defense is acceptable, and they may accept the idea of using violence in defense of the innocent in concrete personal encounters. Of course, absolute pacifists who emphasize complete non-resistance will not accept such violence at all. I would say the word you're looking for here, if you want to be better than just someone who tries to be peaceful, is radical pacifist, where you go far beyond the set point, far beyond the current norm of how much non-violence you're willing to engage in. See how far you can push it, the non-violence. But pacifism as anti-warism will argue that the violence of war is of a different kind. War is dehumanizing violence that kills masses of persons without any concern for them as persons. We actually just saw detailed debates about quantifying mathematically the exact degree of concern isn't how much collateral damage certain militaries allow as policy. So this is a bit black and white. It's if you look at real arguments made by people actually doing this in militaries. There was one I just shared. The math is not like this. Anyway, so this is not right. Along these lines, Thomas Nagel claims that we should be able to justify to the victim what is being done to them in light of morally relevant facts about them. At the level of personal violence, it is possible to say that an aggressor deserves the violence that is inflicted upon him. But at the level of war, this personal element is lost, and instead we have killing en masse, which is an assault on human dignity. And of course, collective guilt is a war crime. Remember that anytime you blame the Jews or the Islamists for anything, collective guilt is a war crime, full stop. 4.1. Killing combatants and killing quote-unquote the guilty. One aspect of the deontological condemnation of war focuses on the killing of combatants, although the killing of combatants has also been connected to contingent pacifism by way of just war theory's proportionality constraint. A lot of work is being done by that proportion, which, as I was mentioning, is discussed in more detail in some recent stuff that I posted. A pacifist might argue that it is wrong to kill enemy combatants because killing is always wrong. Such an argument runs counter to the just war ideal that combatants can be killed. Critics will argue that pacifism thus fails to distinguish between innocence and guilt, quote unquote, and quote unquote. Why they put those in quotes? In this case, I don't know. It's not a moral realist writing this article. Why do they care? As Anscombe puts this, quote, pacifism teaches people to make no distinction between the shedding of innocent blood and the shedding of any human blood, unquote. We have seen that on the left lately. The just war tradition holds that it is permissible to kill enemy combatants because these combatants are, in some sense, no longer innocent. Those who claim that it is acceptable to kill enemy combatants claim that enemy soldiers deserve to die, or at least that it is not wrong to kill them. I mean, the second is a lot less gross than the first one. I don't think that's what any individual soul exactly deserves. Souls deserve redemption, and they deserve forgiveness, conditional forgiveness conditional on repentance. That's, I think, a more Christian message than the notion that an enemy soldier deserves to die. They deserve to be held captive until they repent, and that's why I give you a Bible in prison. There are open questions in just war theory about how this notion of desert functions. One of the problems is that young conscripted soldiers may not fully support the war into which they are drafted, and thus it may seem odd to claim that such soldiers are guilty for or deserve to be killed in a war for which they hold no personal responsibility. Indeed. But the most obvious way to justify killing combatants, note that's not saying they deserve it, it's just they're going to say it's a way to justify it. The most obvious way to justify killing combatants is to link such killing to the notion of self-defense. In war, soldiers are confronted with enemy combatants who will kill them and their comrades if they aren't killed first. In the language of just war theory, an enemy combatant is guilty of the crime of aggression, and in the context of war, this crime is punishable by death. They should focus more on defending the civilians, the peacetime civilian existence of their nation or community. But this notion of killing as punishment can easily be connected to the issue of the death penalty. For deontological proponents of the death penalty, murderers can be executed because the nature of their crime merits death, while consequentialists add in other considerations such as the deterrent value of the death penalty. The deontological approach focuses on the moral desert that is connected to the guilt of the murderer. I don't particularly agree with the death penalty, by the way. I don't think prisons are that expensive. And I say that even as, my mother's abuser escaped a maximum security prison and police had to recapture him. And he did eventually die in custody. He was a dangerous offender, one of the first 30-odd dangerous offenders in Canada, of which my mother dated too. But that doesn't mean I'd advocate the death penalty for him. And I insisted on seeing the cell where he was held as a child, actually. But I wouldn't advocate the death penalty. I think our prisons are secure enough to hold these guys, and they can read the Bible all their life if they want, or read the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy. They can't do that if they're dead. And I think victims deserve repentance, and for that reason, the death penalty is wrong. This notion of guilt as a moral quality that adheres to an individual in light of his past actions is also found in the idea that enemy combatants may be killed. Original sin kind of puts a problem in this. Those individuals who are engaged in fighting have done something or have adopted some characteristic that makes it permissible to kill them. And maximum versions of deontological pacifism maintain that killing is never permitted, even the killing of enemy soldiers. They may also claim that the death penalty is wrong, and they may deny that killing in self-defense is ever justifiable. Opponents of war may also deny that international aggression is punishable by death. A more subtle argument along these lines will claim that it is wrong to kill enemy combatants because enemy combatants are occasionally, or usually, depending on the strength of this particular claim, not responsible for their participation in war. This is especially true of conscript armies who are forced to fight. A pacifist might want to make an exception for killing soldiers who have malicious intent, but they may argue that it is immoral to kill soldiers who are forced to fight. It's certainly better to capture, prisoners of war, right? It would be great if we could just, from the perspective of any army fighting a war, from a moral perspective, it would be great to just sort of put a big jail cell over the enemy army and just lock them all up all with one fell swoop. No fighting, just you're locked up. We'll talk about it, 4.2, killing non-combatants. Although some maximal versions of deontological pacifism will claim that it is wrong even to kill combatants in war, other versions will argue that war is wrong primarily because of the risk to non-combatants. A cherished principle of the just war tradition is the idea of non-combatant immunity. This idea holds that those not actually engaged in the fighting should not be put at risk and should not be deliberately targeted. This idea is often connected to the idea that the innocent should not be killed. Non-combatants are presumed to be innocent and thus immune from being killed. There is an open question as to whether all non-combatants are really innocent, but the just war tradition stipulates that non-combatants should be immune from intentional harm. A version of pacifism can thus be derived from this principle of the just war tradition by arguing against wars that do in fact end up killing innocent non-combatants. They must mean in significant number, because if they can't just mean at least one. Just war pacifists will argue that this is especially true given the nature of modern warfare, which includes the use of, I'm assuming modern warfare has at least one just war, which includes the use of mechanized weapons, aerial bombardment, and weapons of mass destruction. Such weaponry does not adequately discriminate between combatants and non-combatants. Thus, modern war cannot be just according to the pacifist interpretation of the just war tradition. We're starting to see more and more targeted weapons, I think, as technology advances. As it's a moral technology, even for a sociopathic state that wants to be able to justify its war as a just war tradition, they have a technological incentive, we would hope, to develop more targeted weapons. The just war tradition, however, allows that innocent non-combatants may be killed according to the principle of double effect. This idea is derived in the Christian tradition from Aquinas, who holds that a single act may have two effects. Aquinas uses an example of killing in self-defense. The act has one effect of saving a life and another effect of killing the aggressor. Killing an aggressor in self-defense may be permitted if the death of the aggressor is not the primary intention of the defensive act. It is significant that Aquinas does not expand this discussion to make it permissible to kill an innocent third party, but the just war tradition has employed this idea in a way that makes it permissible to kill innocent third parties, non-combatants in war, so long as the primary intention is to accomplish a legitimate war aim, and so long as the killing of innocents is merely a foreseen but unintended secondary effect, with the information available to them at the time, with a reasonable search for information. Absolute pacifists will argue against this employment of the doctrine of double effect and will claim that the killing of the innocent in war is always wrong, even if it is an unintended effect. Indeed, some pacifists may also claim that since we know that war will kill non-combatants, it is disingenuous to claim that the deaths of innocent non-combatants are not intended. The pacifist may claim that the real problem of war is that non-combatants are killed intentionally as a means of warfare. Although Anscombe argued against pacifism, she made a similar argument in her criticism of the attacks on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Quote, "It is nonsense to pretend that you do not intend to do what is the means you take to your chosen end." Unquote. Anscombe thought that war could be justified if it did not directly intend to kill non-combatants. And Anscombe thought that pacifists were wrong to ignore the distinction between shedding innocent blood and shedding blood in just warfare. But pacifists might argue in response that war is wrong because innocent non-combatants are killed whether intentionally or not. And let's just note today, on October 7th, folks, that the participants of the Nova Festival were innocent non-combatants, and it is in fact the intention of Hamas to kill non-combatants. This is in their founding charter. If you don't believe me, read Hamas's founding charter. This is does not prove the lack of intent on the side of any other military, but it completely proves the presence of genocidal intent on the